In this session, we're going to look at Azure Data Factory development, and we're specifically going to use an Azure Synapse scenario. But let me first talk about what is a modern data automation using the Azure Stack and Azure Data Factory. So first of all, all of these data integration solutions will have at least the following components. It'll have a source databases or source systems. And, Azure Data Factory, like other vendors, we support a number of supported sources. Obviously, there's only a couple there, but effectively, through BimlFlex, we support all of the link services, link service types that you can find in Azure Data Factory. So if the link service exists in Azure Data Factory, you will be able to use it within BimlFlex. We then have the next, the ingest and process. Now, with a modern data solution, you really want the ability to use either Azure Data Factory natively, integration services or integration service runtimes, if that is what you need to do, because sometimes not everything is supported in Azure Data Factory, or sometimes you have some integration services running. You also want to be able to use Azure Mapping Data Flows, which is obviously, as you know, is one of the newer features from in the Azure Stack. And then Azure Databricks, if you need to do use clusters and run clusters on there. So, a modern data integration solution, you will need to have at least the ability to run one or all of those things, or have access to all of those things. And then obviously you want to target your databases. Now with BimlFlex, we target all the SQL Server versions, managed instance, Azure SQL DB, virtual machine. And also you want to target Azure Synapse if you want to, Snowflake, and then also Delta Lake. So those are really the four, in the Azure Stack, the four target systems that you want to process. So any source that is supported, your layer of ingestion, you want to be able to use the full functionality of those four processes in the middle. And then obviously you want to target and switch between those targets. So if you wanted to go and use Synapse, or you have your metadata target Synapse, and then Snowflake, or then Synapse, either one of those, you can switch between those target environments fairly easily. So let's look at what the BimlFlex solution architecture and what that looks like. So obviously, first of all, again, you have your sources, then you'll have the BimlFlex application sitting over here. You have the BimlFlex application that connects to your source systems to bring in the metadata. We never touch your data. We never actually read your data. We'll only bring in the metadata. So BimlFlex is one of the few applications that do not actually require access to your data. And then all of that metadata will be persisted in our metadata database. Now, this is the repository where all the metadata is persisted and will be used when you do your runs, your builds and your runs. You then have options within the application to do business modeling, should you choose to. Obviously, highly recommended to first create a target business model, and then connect that business model, and then create a data vault if that's what you want to do, or data marts. You could also just do source to staging or source to a landing. So if you want to just use BimlFlex initially just to bring up, land a bunch of data into a data lake, that can also be done. So it's a very quick and easy way to actually just get data out of your source systems and persist them either in a data lake or in a Delta Lake. So anyway, this is the sort of first layer of the modeling side of BimlFlex. So this is where you would do all your modeling, your source to target mappings, and any of those kinds of things is in the application. Once you're done with the application, you're happy with your solution, and you say, listen, we now want to go and deploy or run this. We obviously then move into what we would call the sort of the back-end side of things, right? So the front-end side of things is where you would do all the metadata management, modeling, and then you get into the back-end side of things where you want to do something. So that metadata that is now in that BimlFlex database will be used and passed down to our build templates. And again, what I'm going to show you in a little bit here is that all of this can be automated in an Azure DevOps pipeline, which is the way we're going to execute it. So what we're going to do is we're going to have all of our build templates over there, which is where all the metadata is passed into existing templates, but where you can also go and extend them out or customize our templates should you need to add additional functionality. We then generate out all the automation artifacts. Now, key point to note here, and this is where one of the key differences between BimlFlex and all other vendors is we generate all the standard artifacts as if they were written by hand. There is no internal process that you require application. Once you've run the build and generated all these artifacts, you are now in 100% standard Microsoft space, where you can have all your SQL scripts, all your Azure Data Factory pipelines, all of your link servers, they're all sitting that can be checked into your source control. So from this point forward over here, after you've run the build, you are now outside of our tool set. In other words, everything that you have here is what we would call the runtime, and that's where you would harness the full power of the Microsoft Azure stack. You do not require any runtime server from BimlFlex. So there is no runtime license requirement. There's no runtime components required that you need to have to execute our application that is going to cost you additional money. So all of these artifacts then can get checked into your source control if you want to. You can connect that up to Azure DevOps pipelines. We also generate PowerShell scripts and all the JSON files or ARM templates that you need to deploy your solution out. So all of this stuff is would follow your normal workflow, your normal change control process through your source control. These deployment artifacts then will be deployed, and it will be deployed to whichever environment it is. So after they are deployed, they will either be creating SSIS packages, but in this case, we're obviously going to focus on the Azure Data Factory component of it. But you can also generate out your Azure Data Flow mappings, and soon also your Azure your Databricks pipelines, or your Databricks, or code, push down code. Then all of that SQL scripts that we generate, all of the standard SQL scripts that will create your SQL Server Data Tools projects, can be deployed to, either SQL Server, Synapse, and we also create all the scripts for Snowflake, and we create all the table scripts, and we also create stored procedures that is run on the environment. So we do not have a process where the application, because we do not have a runtime, executes and destroys the code that it is running. So if you wanted to debug or have a look at the code that we're running, they are all stored procedures that are pushed out to SQL Server, Synapse, Snowflake, and then obviously Delta Lake is relevant to your Azure mapping flows. So Delta Lake and Azure mapping flows goes hand in hand with the Azure Data Factory. So let's have a quick look at how we would configure a project in BimlFlex, right, for Azure Data Factory automations. So first of all, there is a project that we'll set up over here in a batch, and this is what you would call maybe a workflow and a workload. And then also what we choose the integration template here. So what we're doing is we're saying, listen, the project that we're working with is going to use Azure Data Factory to ingest and process the data. Over there at the integration template, you would choose integration services, or you would choose Azure mapping data flows, depending on which way you want to configure it. Well, then obviously you say, we want to connect to this source. We want to move data from the source database here through Azure Data Factory. And what we also need to do when we're working in the Azure Data Factory space is we want to create a landing area where we're going to land the data. So as you know, Azure Data Factory, the copy command from Azure Data Factory is a bulk copy process. So it's going to land the data somewhere. So if we're working with Synapse, we can land the data directly into Synapse, but we give you the option to either land the data directly into Synapse in a table, and you can also configure it to use Polybase, or you can land it in an Azure Data Lake. There's benefits to both. If you land it in Azure Data Lake, that data can also be passed down to other processes for maybe machine learning processes or used in other processes. So landing the data in Data Lake could also flow into a separate process where that data could be used for some other processes. So once the data is landed, we then obviously need to say, where do we want to stage the data? Do we want to persist the data? And then that's where we now go and create a Azure Synapse database. The Azure Synapse database will have SQL scripts to create the tables. It'll have stored procedures, and there'll be a pipeline to execute that whole process there. So we'll execute the process. The next thing we can do here is, if we're just going to go from source into staging and or persistent staging, which is just the historized version of your source system, this is the configuration that you would have. If, for instance, you do want to implement Data Vault on your systems, you would also say, I would like to connect my source, going to staging and persistent staging, and in that same process, I also want to go and pass it into my Data Vault. You tend to, with Data Vault, take the data from all the way from the source to the end, and then you would just have this set up here. And that would give you a single workflow. Now you can optionally, you can configure BimlFlex to say, listen, stop at my staging environment, I'll load my data vault separate or in a different process. All of that is created for you. We will then go ahead and import some objects, and I'll show you how we do this very quickly. I'm not going to take you through the entire process of the modeling. I'll just do a very light demo in BimlFlex. So this will give you an idea of, the automation that you want to do or the interaction of do. So let's go ahead to the demo. I'm going to now show you the demo. So I'm going to actually start the demo slightly differently. First, I'm going to go into our Azure DevOps environment, and I'm going to run the pipeline. So this is going to run the result, and I'll take you through that real quick. So I'm going to run the result, and while the result is processing, and what the result means is it's going to go ahead and take the metadata of one of our samples and go and create the Azure Data Factory pipelines, deploy the Synapse database structure, and have everything ready for me. So by the time I'm done showing you the application, I can go back and just show you the results. Then I'm going to go into the application, configure the metadata, and just generally show you around the application. But we're not going to do a deep dive into the application because other webinars or demos of us do that. Then I'm going to jump into Azure Data Factory, just show you around the pipeline a little bit, and show you what has been generated from the metadata, all the standard stuff that we generate. And I'm going to execute the pipeline. And once the pipeline is completed executing, I'll take you into Synapse and just show you the results. It's always good to see some data, that it's actually loaded some data. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to just show you, again, because we build standard Azure Data Factory, you have full access to all of the processes within Azure Data Factory. So if you wanted to customize or extend one of our templates to do something else that our standard template isn't doing, it could be as simple as sending an email or have a wait command. And I'll just pop a wait command in there for you just to show you that it can be done. I'll just show you very quickly in our development environment where if you wanted to customize or extend it out, I'll run the pipeline again. So it picks up that change, runs the pipeline again, and then just review in the Data Factory. I'll just show you the customization. So that really is it. So what I'm going to do now is just give you a quick BimlFlex demo of automating Azure Data Factory development. Okay, so before I'm going to run the pipeline, I just need to create my environment. So here at Virgins, we have some utility scripts that we provide our customers. Effectively, this script is going to create my entire Azure environment. It's going to create the resource group. It's going to create the key vault. It's going to add all my secrets to the key vault, all my passwords, etc., my connection strings to the key vault. It's going to create my databases. It's going to set up for us, it will set up our source databases, our Biml catalog, and it'll set up our target Synapse database. We'll also register all the connections to our tools. In other words, it'll create, when I open my Azure Data Studio, I'll have a connection to my target server. And then we will update some metadata in our catalog. That is just updating from our samples that we have. We'll just update the passwords or the connection strings. And then we will also create some of our templates. So this create template actually creates all of our Biml project files that we need. And this is the demo script, but we provide this to our customers, and they can use all or some of these scripts. So effectively, I'm going to run this. It's going to take a little while, and then it's going to have my entire environment set up. I'll take you through the empty environment before we run the pipeline. So off we go. And this is going to run for, anything from, depending on our connection, anything from 1 to 5 minutes. So let's just have a quick review of what those scripts have created for us. So firstly, it's created an empty data factory here. If we look at the data factory here, I've got no pipelines in it. And that's what, when we run the Azure DevOps pipeline build, it's going to create all the Azure Data Factories for me, and it's going to create all the link services, etc. for me. So the other thing that it would have done is also created, and I'm just bringing Azure Data Studio over here, it would have created all my databases for me. So in this process here, I would have my source database. Again, these things you may not need to create, but here is my Synapse database here that has at the moment just the structure. It's got no tables, no stored procedures, etc. And here are my Biml databases. So in this BimlFlex database here, I will have my sample loaded. So this is just our normal Azure Synapse sample that if you load BimlFlex, you could use the sample as is and just have a look at the whole process. So what I have right now is I have these empty structures, which is what we want. And now we want to go ahead and run the Azure DevOps pipeline. So let me go into Azure DevOps and sort that out for you. So here I'm connected to our Verigen's demo repository, and one of the repositories that we have here is the Synapse one. And as you can see here, I've got my BimlFlex project, which is really effectively just our sample and our sample scripts. I have my setup scripts here, and then what I will also have is pipelines. So what the pipeline is going to do, so I have my Azure Data Factory Synapse pipeline here. So I'm going to run this pipeline, and what this pipeline will do, let me just close that. What this pipeline is going to do is it's going to actually go and grab the metadata, apply it to all our templates, build and create all the Azure Data Factory pipelines, and commit them to GitHub. And what will happen if you commit them to GitHub, obviously our Data Factory is connected to GitHub, so we use Git integration for that. And it's also going to create the database project for Synapse and deploy all of the assets to the Synapse server. So again, you can automate all of this, or you can automate parts of it, or you can connect this to your standard change control process of building it into a dev branch or a test branch or a publish branch and then committing that. Again, it will fit with whatever your current change control process is. So let me go and just run this pipeline, and that's all I'm going to do. And again, we make all of these scripts available to our customers. If you need assistance in setting up your pipelines, we also provide assistance for that. So it's going to run the pipeline here, and we're going to come back and just look at the results, and then I'll take you through the Azure Data Factory and Synapse structure. Let me just give you a quick overview of the BimlFlex application. We're not going to go in depth in this. It's covered in other videos, because we're really just focusing on the Azure Data Factory and Azure Synapse deployment today. But here we go. Let's have a look here. So we've just got one of our samples loaded here. This is our starting point sample. Effectively, there's no metadata in here other than a couple of configured connections. We've configured some basic projects here. But effectively, the first thing you do in most projects is you want to bring some metadata into the application. Now, so here we go. We just select our connection, and then we go import metadata, connect to the database, and now we can choose the objects we want to bring in. There's a number of settings here which we cover in other presentations all around just metadata importing, around how do you filter out what you want if you've got large data sets. But in this case, I'm just going to go and select all of them. I'm not going to worry about any of these things here, which is naming conventions, etc. And I'll hit import metadata. This goes off to the source database and brings in all the information schema or the metadata. It does not touch any of your actual data. At no point do we in BimlFlex actually look at any of your data. There's no preview data or any of those functionality. And that is because of security reasons. We want to make sure that our application can sit completely disconnected from any of your data structures. Once you're in the metadata here, you can do a whole bunch of different things. You can go in to look at the actual table here. You could add some query overrides, like additional join statements, etc. Basic metadata configuration stuff. You can look at individual columns. You can switch on columns. You can look at the data types. You can really just look at it from that point of view. Again, you have other ways to get to the same metadata here. You can go look at it through the sort of tree view here. Go look at the actual customer here and the columns. I'm going to jump over and switch to the actual sample that we're using, which is this one here, number 17. Again, as you can see here, we have samples for Snowflake, for SQL database managed instance, a whole bunch of change tracking, etc. So just to take you through what we have configured for the Synapse and Azure Data Factory, I'll start off just look at the project, which we saw in the presentation, and I'll look at the source project here. So as you can see here, we have the source, we have the staging, we have ODS, and we have the data vault here, because we want to say, listen, we're going to take it through there. These is configurable, obviously. And then over here, we have chosen to use Azure Data Factory instead of SQL Server integration services or mapping flow. Now, again, if you wanted to switch between Data Factory and SIS, you could just do that fairly easily, depending on, obviously, if you don't have specific technology metadata. And then lastly here, we go to connections. And again, here we have all of the, I'll just look at the staging one for now, because that's where we're going to take the data. So in the staging environment here, you can see here that we have set it Synapse here. We have the link service type here of SQL Server Data Warehouse or Synapse. And again, you can configure integration runtimes over here. You can configure key vaults. You can configure connection strings and key vaults. And this works pretty much exactly the same as it would work inside of the Azure Data Factory portal. So you have control over all of these things here within our sample set. So all of these are exactly the same as you'll see in the Azure Data Factory portal. You can configure your link service exactly the same way as you would do there, test it out, or etc. There's also obviously other things that we could do here. Just briefly show you if you want to run the Data Vault Accelerator. Again, I'm not going to go into detail here, but there's our Data Vault Accelerator, where you have the schema diagram where we can have some data lineage. If you want to look at some data lineage, you can go into the tool and do some data lineage. You can do some business modeling, which again, I'm not going to do now, but you can do business modeling based on different processes here. And that's just a very quick overview of the BimlFlex application. As I said, we're going to use existing metadata that is configured for Synapse specifically with Azure Data Factory. Okay, so the build is completed, and all of the artifacts would be in there now. So if I go back to the repository and just show you around, so now all of the database project files is in here for my Synapse server. It will create a SQL Server Data Tools project for you if you want to use, but you have all of your files here. You'll have all of your Data Vault files here. Let's just have a look at just the staging environment here. So we'll have my tables here. There's all of my tables for my staging here, tables and my stored procedures to load them. So all of this code is, would look the same as if you have built it by hand. So if I just look at one of those files there, you can see here, this is just standard SQL Server stored procedure code, right? That is compatible with SQL Server Data Tools and DAC-back deployments. We would also have our data factory here, and it would have created all our factories, our pipelines, etc. And as you can see again here, these are just JSON files. So these again are exactly the same structure and content of if you building your Azure Data Factory, if you're using JSON, or if you have an Azure Data Factory and you view the JSON. And this JSON here is absolutely standard. So again, if you were to build your Azure Data Factory by hand, not sure why you would, but if you wanted to build it by hand, your JSON files would look exactly the same as this. So all of my Azure Data Factory artifacts is here, all my database artifacts is here, and it would have been deployed. So if I now go over to my data factory and I just refresh this, you will see that I now have all of my pipelines sitting over here. So I'll just refresh this. There's all my pipelines. Oh, we're just going to look at the source of staging. We have broken this up into batches. So if we just look at the main batch here, you'll see, and let me just fit this away here. You'll see here that I have a orchestration. It looks if it should run the batch if the batch is in a certain state, and it's sort of the orchestration from BimlFlex. And then you'll see that it's broken up into 3 batches. Now these sub batches, as we would call them, is based on order of the needing load. Should I load these tables before these tables or these tables? So BimlFlex will figure that all out for you and say, okay, hold on, we need to load this set of tables before we load this set of tables. And then we have the sub batches, which calls the individual pipelines here, the individual copy pipelines here. And within these, you'd obviously run, they do a copy to the, I suppose, the copy pipelines, which effectively will take the data from your source and land it. So these are very simple pipelines here. Again, we do some high watermark lookups here using the new script activity that Microsoft has introduced recently, which also shows you how quickly we respond to new functionality coming from Microsoft. We do all of that, and then we have the copy pipeline here, which effectively is just a source, going to a landing area. We'll do some row count logging of how many rows were copied, and then we'll process the staging environment and then also a data vault. Now, again, this is optional. You have a setting within BimlFlex to say, process this in a separate pipeline or add it to this pipeline. And then obviously we would do the sort of logging of the high watermark again. So all of this, as you can see, is pretty standard, or looks the same as if you were to write it. So this is all there. You can review them, you can run them, you can analyze them. And one of the great things about the way we approach this is, should you have Azure Purview running, you can connect this to your Azure Purview and get all of that lineage information, all of that rich information of your data coming and going inside of your Purview structure. So let's go ahead and I'm just going to go and execute this pipeline here. I'm going to go debug it. Again, obviously you can add triggers in BimlFlex. You can go and say, oh, this is a rolling window or whatever it is. So we have the ability for you to add triggers also. But for this purpose here, just for the demo, I'm just going to run the debug one. And I'm just going to say, okay, and that's going to go off. And now start this pipeline and start loading data. So while that is running, let me just show you in Azure Data Studio what the result of the SQL scripts are. So in Azure Studio here, I'm just going to go and refresh this one. And now what I should have here is there's all my tables created. There's my landing tables, my ODS tables, there's my data vault tables. I even have some dimensions and facts in here, which should be over here. And then based on all of those tables there, again, here's all my stored procedures. Now, the benefit, obviously, using stored procedures and having them, I suppose, look and feel like any stored procedure you would have written is that should there be any performance concerns on your target structure, you could go and actually debug the stored procedures. The great thing about that is you can actually have the stored procedure code. You can look at them. You can sort of script them out. You can review the stored procedure code. And just, generally just have that there. And because it's also checked into your source control, you can have your normal process of comparing before and after. Should we release new versions of the software and seeing, well, was the new version, did it fix the thing you asked to be fixed, if that was the case? But you have standard process here where you can go and look through everything here and just see exactly what the code is that we do to load your sources staging environment, right? And within BimlFlex, we also have various different settings that controls how these stored procedures are optimized. In other words, if you're, for argument's sake, say if you're using change data capture as a source, the stored procedure may look differently because it doesn't have to do its own delta detection. Or if you have change tracking installed, again, the stored procedure could look differently. And obviously, if you're using SQL databases, you could also use temporal tables and things like that. So there's a whole different set of options that you have because we are integrating that natively with the Microsoft stack there. So let's go ahead just and have a look at the Azure Data Factory pipeline. And then, so that's running. So I'll come back to you as soon as it's finished and just show you some of the data. And then we'll look at how do we actually make a change to the process, the Azure Data Factory pipeline. All right, so the Azure Data Factory pipeline is now completed. It's run all the way through. So let's have a quick look, just a very brief look in the database here. So just going to really show you that in my tables here, I will now have data. And, there's some data there in that table there. And because I did a data vault, I'll just show you the equivalent table I'll just grab the hub here. So I'll also have data in that data vault table structures there. So it would have loaded the data from the source, landed the data, put it into staging. If I had persistent staging or historized source system switched on, it'll load it into my persistent staging environment. And then because I said I also want to load my data vault, he went ahead and loaded it into the data vault. So now I have an end-to-end process run. So what is next? So obviously the next thing we want to do here is just head back over to Azure Data Factory. So let's look at changing something or adding something. So I may, with data warehousing, there are a lot of things that can be automated, which is automatable, if we would say this. So we automate the automatable. But then in some cases there, you would have some bespoke requirements or different requirements. So just give you an idea here. So let me just go into this pipeline here. So let's just say for some reason, this is your standard process here, and we have a number of these extension points, what we call extension points. But let's just say for some reason, or for whatever purpose you want to do is, after you've run this script here, whatever the last script is, you want to do something else. So now what I mean by something else is you want to maybe do any of these things, right? You could call a webhook, you could call any of these commands here, or really anything here. You could even process some of the machine learning stuff here. So within BimlFlex, you have access to take any Azure Data Factory pipeline that we have and add anything to it. So I'm going to just to show you what I'm going to do is I'm just going to simply add a wait command. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to add a wait command here, and I'm just going to connect this up to that. That's what I'm going to do in BimlFlex, right? And just to keep it very simple. Now, I don't just want to add it to this one. What happens if I wanted to add it to all of these? So I can either add it to one of these pipelines, or I can add it to all of these pipelines. So in this case, I'm just going to show you very quickly that I'm going to be adding it to all of these pipelines. That is all of these pipelines associated with this batch. So let me head over into Biml Studio and just show you what that looks like. All right, so this is Biml Studio. So as we spoke about, there's a front-end application, the user interface, which is BimlFlex. And then there's obviously the Biml Studio side of things, right? The back-end side of things, which is where if you needed to or wanted to preview what your results going to look like, or if you wanted to go and add an additional customization or extensions to your result or to your pipelines, you would come into this tool here. So this is obviously it's going to show you all your tables, etc. It's going to show you your link or your data factory, your link services, and all your pipelines here. And you can go and look and review all of this and say, oh yeah, that's what it's going to create. So this kind of gives you a preview of everything that it's going to create. But just to show you what we want to do now is extend something out. So what I want to do here is obviously these pipelines here, I want to change them or customize them or add something to them. So we have what's called extension points. And right at the top here, I'm just going to grab this one here, right? Which, as you see, there's a number of extension points there, and we can add more to them. Let me just clean this up a little bit here because I don't need all of these documentation that tells you how to do this. Obviously, we have extensive documentation online that does this. So I'll zoom in here a little bit here so you can see what it is. So this is just a very simple wait command. And again, the commands, as I said, you have access to all of those Azure Data Factory things here. But effectively, we're just going to say, I want to wait for 10 seconds. I just want to put this in here. Now, one of the things that you have within BimlFlex with these extension points is, and these templates, is the target here. So what target means is, do I want to just do it on this pipeline, or do I want to do it on all the pipelines associated with this batch? Now, remember I said I'm going to put it for all of the batch. So all you need to do here is put the batch name in, and I'm going to leave the rest like it is. And again, you can go and code 10 things in here, 20 things in here, you know, as much as you want or as little as you want. So all I'm going to do here is just add that in and then save that. And once I've saved that, again, you can now go and check that into source control and build all of that out again, which I'm going to do in the background here. But you also have the ability here to build this locally. In other words, if you're a developer and you don't want to put it through the pipelines because you're just in the development environment and you want to look at what it looks like, you can again go ahead here and build it locally and deploy it maybe to the dev system, dev Azure Data Factory manually or using scripts. So what I'll do here is I'll just go and build this and I'll show you the build output. So I'll just see the build button here and wait for this to build locally. All right, so the build is completed successfully. It's only took 27 seconds to build this locally. And what would happen is in my BimlFlex project, I would have now an output folder. Now in the output folder, again, very similar to what you see in the pipeline or in the repository, I'll have a data factory here. And inside of the data factory, I'll have a ARM template that I can deploy everything with. I'll also have all the multiple JSON files. So these are what really gets checked into my source code, my GitHub here, right? So these are all the ones that is manually checked in. And I'm actually just going to check one of those in just to change things around. I'm not going to, I'll change just the data factories that we've changed. I'll check that in and show you how that looks. But effectively, yeah, everything here would have been done correctly. So what I'm going to do here is just grab all of these data factory pipelines and just pop them into my GitHub repository and then check that in, and I should then see the result in my data factory immediately. So I've copied all those files into my repository, what I want to do. So all I'm going to do here now is just go ahead and stage all of these changes here and commit them, right? So I'm going to stage the changes here, again, following whatever your current best practices in your environment of checking it into a dev branch or test branch, and or effectively I'm just checking it straight into main because obviously I'm in a demo mode here. So I'm just going to go and say edit extension point, be as descriptive as you need to be within your organization, and I'm just going to commit my stage changes, and I'm going to sync this up. And as this is syncing up, what I should then see in my data factory is those changes is immediately available. So if I refresh my data factory here, I think this would work. Come on, this would work. I'll refresh my data factory over here. And what I should see in this here now is, if everything has gone correctly, is there's my wait post copy there for 10 seconds. And I should see it in all the other ones, right? So again, as I say, it's very easy to go and change this around and add whatever you want. And also because you then have full access to all of this, you could have called the Databricks, you could do one of these, you could have called an Azure function to do something that's bespoke to your environment. So again, as I said, with BimlFlex, because we integrate natively with Azure Data Factory and with Azure Synapse, etc., we use the full power of Azure Data Factory, and we allow you to then extend it out to use even the rest of the Azure Factory, to use all of it, right? Not just some part of it, not just the ADF copy command, right? And again, because it's all in Azure Data Factory, it will integrate in with whatever other processes you have in your environment, whether that's Azure Purview. It can call things outside of our framework. It could call a completely different pipeline should it need to create a pipeline that is maybe created by a different team and is already running in its existing pipelines, right? So that is your Azure Data Factory integration and building all of that out.